Helygfwarad. Why can't we all be monsters? Molly and Greege had trespassed to get on the long branch of the willow tree. Most of the tree grew straight up on the lawn of the blue-flaked and decrepit house, but their branch hung over the paved road like an arm, taunting the traffic that ran underneath it. Its green leaves draped over its head that curved downward to face the street. The short-haired girl reached into her bag and pulled out a camera that she pointed down to the road. Like, we ever think about how evolution might have got it wrong? Molly was stocky, with a rounded face that emphasized the furrows of her brow and the sleek way her smile spread across its surface. Seems a pretty foolproof setup to me. Greege, a boy with long fingernails and a pointed nose, took the camera from her hands and snapped a picture of a man driving along underneath them. Things die if they can't live. Those that live got the stuff, so they pass it on. We kinda said that doesn't work, though. She stood on the limb and peered down the dark street to see a larger van approaching in the moonlight. She motioned to her companion to hand her the camera. She zoomed in on the approaching vehicle. Like, as a species, I mean. I just got my wisdom teeth out last month, and I'm pretty sure I'd be dead, 'cause, you know, they were coming out of the side of my face. The driver's eyes were drooping. Molly snapped a picture just as he was shoving his hand into his mouth, hoping that the pain would keep him awake. So if we can make it so things that don't work for evolution still work for us, what's to say we don't have better ideas packed into our unnatural selection? We already did that a little. The boy looked down at the creaking front door of the house. Scuba gear, airplanes, both told evolution it didn't do its job. That's weak compared to what we could be doing, though. The girl sat back down and looked over their saved pictures. You gotta admit, having like 6 triple-jointed limbs would be pretty fucking rad. You hear people complain about joint pain now. Imagine what the whining with... He paused. What is that, 18 joints? Yeah, basic multiplication. The girl pointed the camera upwards and shocked some sleeping birds out of the willow with its flash. Good job, genius. I'm just saying there are practical questions even what... Greege's affirmation of the seriousness of considering multi-limbed creatures was cut short by Molly's hand covering his mouth. She pointed to a velvet silhouette making its way over the hill at the edge of their vision. The mass curled into itself and brought forth a lone emergent tentacle with an orb dangling off the end of it. It slinked across the tar of the road, stopping every few minutes. Each time the tentacle stopped, the orb at its end would glow a dark red, then shake. Molly and Greege looked at each other for a moment. Greege motioned down the tree with his wide eyes, the rest of his body refusing to move. Molly followed his gaze, then met his terrified eyes with deadpan mock horror. She smiled wide and shook her head slowly before turning her focus to the spectacle before them. As the orb tentacle slinked closer to them, they noticed a rattling noise with each set of shakes. The monster's limb was sleek, like wet seal skin, giving off a glossy sheen under the streetlights. The main mass of the monster was still over the hill when the orb came under the protruding branch of the willow tree. The orb glowed again and rose up further off the ground. The rattling got louder. Molly looked down at the orb tentacle, and her thoughts were not of terror but of fascination. Screw tri-jointed limbs, she thought. I want one of whatever that thing is. Greege had stopped breathing and was desperately waiting for when he could resume. The orb's smoldering red light flashed brighter in a state of alarm as the tentacle elevated toward the willow branch. Greege and Molly sat, unmoving, as the rattling from within the orb rose from a dull shake into the animated internal movement of an alarm bell. The tentacle rose through the draping greenery of the willow until it was face-to-face with Molly. Greege steadied his position on the branch, wiping the sweat off his hands to grasp the bark. Molly spoke. Hey dude, chill. She held out her hands. We just want to watch. The air around the orb was cold and damp, with a small amount of frost forming on Molly's hands as she reached for it. The tentacle recoiled at her touch. The red light in its orb flattened and condensed into a beam, and the beam shone on the camera sitting on the branch. What, this? Molly reached for the camera. The tentacle rattled until the whole tree shook with its force. The cold air surrounding the tentacle reached out and tipped each leaf with frost. No pictures. I get it. Molly crashed the camera against the limb of the tree a few times until it broke into pieces. The glowing orb stopped rattling, and its focused beam spread throughout itself until it became the smoldering red from before. Greege turned to Molly and ran a finger down his face to trace his tears shed for the camera. Come on, show us the rest of you, Molly said. The tentacle descended and opened the door to the house. Greege and Molly heard the same rattling noises before, followed by a rumbling from over the hill. The monster crested into view, and for a moment it stood still. It had 18 orbed tentacles that supported a central shaft of a head, which stood fully 30 feet in the air. Sporting no eyes, an icy thin blue-lipped mouth, and thick, long, red hair that draped about itself like the leaves of the weeping willow. The monster then ducked low, collapsing into itself, and moved as a bulge along the tentacle leading into the house. When the bulge approached the willow, the monster emerged from its tentacle and brought its head level with the two humans on the willow branch, bringing 3 of its tentacles up with it. Its blue lips peeled back to reveal flat teeth. The monster spoke. Helygfwarad. The monster's voice sounded like a whistle through branches on a cold day, and seemed to be constantly changing its points of origin, as if the monster was throwing its voice around like a rag doll. That is my name, persons on the branch. The willow's leaves were frozen solid. Helygfwarad. Greege sounded under his breath. Pleased to meet you, Heli. Molly waved in the direction of one of the tentacles. These are your eyes, right? Is that rude to say? Do you just ask a monster what its eyes are? Greege thought. Helygfwarad was slinking back into its tentacle. If you wish to speak more, then come inside. Helygfwarad's form was entirely inside the house. Molly smiled wide. Listen, Greege, I know you might be scared, but there is no way that we can give up on an opportunity like this. She balled up her fists. This is a real, live monster, something that no one has ever seen before. If we can get to know it, then... She opened her eyes to see Greege already halfway down the willow. Got it, he said with a smile. We can ask it why we're not all monsters. He landed and almost fell over. She noticed he was shaking, and that his fingernails were not as long as they were when the night started. You don't have to come if you don't want to. Molly descended the willow. If you're not feeling it's really okay. She looked at him. Don't think of leaving me behind on this one. He took a trembling step toward the house. Not for 1 second. The two entered the parlor of the crumbling house. One of Helygfwarad's tentacles closed the door behind them. After a small entryway, the house was one big room, lacking furniture or adornments besides an industrial-sized freezer on one side of the house. Helygfwarad leaned, relaxed against the far wall, lazily resting some of its tentacles atop the freezer. It opened the freezer and grabbed what looked like a shimmering stalk of parsley, translucent and prismatic in the way it reflected light. Helygfwarad tossed it into its mouth and spoke. You decided to come on in. Well, the whistling voice was coming from one of its tentacles. Make yourself at home if we are to chat. 2 of its tentacles curled and stretched to form chairs. It motioned for Molly and Greege to take a seat. The tentacles were yielding and soft to the touch, though they were sleek and slippery too. Molly opened her mouth to speak, closed it, and opened it again. I have so many questions. Helygfwarad talked through its full mouth. In that case, you 2 go first. It gulped down its vegetable. You're not going to want to go after me, I can tell. Greege immediately stammered. Us, we're just boring everyday humans. Nothing really noteworthy. That's a great way to start off the conversation, Helygfwarad responded. Oh, I'm not interesting at all, but you should still spend some time talking to me despite me not being interesting in the slightest. It waved a few of its free tentacles around the house. Molly followed up. I'm Molly and he's Greege. We're a couple of kids that have lived in this town all our lives, and we spend our nights sitting on the branch of the willow tree taking pictures of people who pass under it. I'm afraid we're going to be on the branch the day it falls, but at the same time I'm looking forward to seeing the look on someone's face when they see us taking pictures as we fall, Greege said while looking straight at the floor. The monster shook its head as laughter filled the house. It took out 2 sprigs of the translucent parsley, each about the size of Molly's torso, and handed them to the humans. Now that's something. I'll take it. Ask away. Molly opened her mouth and the questions would not stop dropping out. One after the other, they cascaded out. How old are you? When did you get so big? Are there others like you? Are there others not like you but not like us? Why do you speak English? What's your native language? What are we eating? On and on her questions went, with Helygfwarad answering. Just about 600 years at this point. I've been this size since I was about 150. I'm the only Helygfwarad that I know of, but there are others that you might call monsters like me. I speak English because I live here, and I think that immigrants should have the courtesy to learn the language of the land, and my Cherokee wasn't cutting it anymore. You can't speak light, Molly, so it won't do you much to know what my native language is. It took another sprig from the freezer, and we're eating what made me as I am. Molly and Greege stopped mid-bite. Greege spit his mouthful out. What do you mean, what made you as you are? He clutched his hands to his head. You're turning us into monsters? Helygfwarad shook his head and leaned down towards the humans, draping them in his red hair. Don't be silly, Greej. Humans are already a type of monster. I'm just changing you into one like me. Molly stared down the orb on her tentacle chair. Stop messing with him like that and answer my questions straight. Helygfwarad laughed, icy and thin, around the room. I wasn't lying, Molly, when I said it made me as I am, but it would take far more than just one sprig to do anything. How much more? A silence fell on the room after Molly's comment. Greej looked at her, his eyes wide. She glanced down at the floor and then up at the monster. It starts around 100 sprigs. Why do you ask? Helygfwarad's whistling was uneven. Why can't we all be monsters, Heli? Molly said softly. People are confusing and inefficient and jaded from the day they're born. She looked up at him, then over to the freezer. The three of them sat there for a few minutes, the only noise in the house being the occasional shuffling of one of Helygfwarad's tentacles. Greej's terror had subsided, but now he looked at Molly with confusion and out the door with longing. Helygfwarad ushered the silence out of the room with his cold whistling. I am resting the night, and then I'm gone for 10 years. It coiled its tentacle chairs away from Molly and Greej, forming a cocoon around its head with its tentacles. We can decide this when I return. 10 fucking years? Molly turned her face to face each of the orbs at the ends of his tentacles in turn. You want me to wait 10 fucking years? Greej put his hand on her shoulder. Come on, Molly, you need some time to think it over. She turned and screamed at him. Like hell I do! She pushed her hand off her shoulder. I finally have a way out of this life where I'm just a powerless weirdo that admits we want to do weird things like take pictures on a weeping willow, where everyone else just pretends that normal life is fine and good and not a burden. A suffocating thing that presses down on every day until small glimmers of weird can poke through. When I return, Molly, Helygfwarad whistled, if you are to be a monster, you need to start thinking like one. What is 10 years to something that lives centuries? It pushed them outside with two of its tentacles, then slammed the door. Greej and Molly looked at each other, then at the ground, attempted a few faltering words with one another, then silently walked in opposite directions. Both of them heard the wind whistling through the branches on the way home.